and welcome to Raw Politics, Newsroom's weekly podcast and video chat on the big political issues. I'm Newsroom political editor Laura Walters, and with me in Wellington is senior political reporter Marc.
Hi.
Hey Marc. And joining us from Auckland is Newsroom co-editor Tim Murphy. Hi Tim.
Hi guys.
Now, today on Raw Politics, we will take a look at Luxon's unforced errors, scrutinise Parliament's first scrutiny week, and do the cost-benefit analysis on saving Indigenous species. And to wrap up, we will offer you some recommendations. Prime Minister Christopher Luxon has jetted off overseas again. This week, he has been in Japan helping businesses seal deals and firming up New Zealand's defence and security relationships with an important strategic partner. But as these things seem to go for the Prime Minister, it hasn't been smooth sailing. And if you're wondering, yep, there is a joke about poor old Betty, the Defence Force 757, and her failure to take off. Now, that failure to launch was only the beginning for Christopher Luxon. He then took his foot and placed it firmly in his mouth when he started by offending a sizable chunk of the business community, calling those on past delegations C-listers and Tagalongs. Now, Tim, you wrote a fantastic editorial for Newsroom Pro this week about the Prime Minister's comments and kind of his general demeanour around this. What do you make of him calling these business leaders Tagalongs and C-listers?
The first thing is that the biggest tag-along in these instances is the politician. And I say that because these trade missions often have very well advanced commercial negotiations and trade negotiations that others have completed. So, for example, the Rocket Lab style thing, the investment in hotels in Queenstown that have come out of this Japan trip, they were going to happen. So the tag-along really is to get the politician, the Prime Minister, next to and beside the great signing of these deals and to get the rub off. So in that respect, that's a political tag. The C-list thing is just an insight, I think, and that's what I wrote in the editorial, that it's a bit of an insight into the way that Luxon's worldview judges the kinds of people he deals with. And some people are people who get things done and are effective and sexy and, they have big swinging corporate revenues, and some don't. I think he would look at lists, and he might have been on trips where there were government agencies and there were university people and academics and maybe even some international school kind of people and scientists and things. And these people don't bring the big bucks swinging in behind them and probably don't deliver the very sexy signing ceremonies that make your trip look a success. One other thing about this, look, it does overshadow or take away the gloss of a journey that should be a good journey for him and for New Zealand. It's important to get to Japan as a top 4 or 5 trading partner. It's important to meet the Japanese leader. Luxon puts his foot in his mouth for a domestic audience more, I think, than he does for the foreign audience. You've been on a trip with him, Laura, and I don't think he does sort of that kind of thing in the actual statesman one-on-one meetings or the multilateral meetings. He saves that for people at home.
He is good at building rapport and relationships, and that comes through with those leaders as well. He makes them feel seen and he treats them like buddies, like they've known each other for a really long time, even though, he hasn't been in this role for very long. And so that does a lot of the heavy lifting for him. He is good in terms of building those relationships. But, there's obviously this instance here, and then on the trip that I was with him on previously, he was called out by some of his business delegation. They said some of his lines on New Zealand now being open for business actually weren't very helpful. They said, we've always been open for business. We've actually been working in this space really hard, to your point earlier, for a really long time to secure past deals and these ones that we're signing at the moment. So he needs to think about his framing there, because yes, it's great that the foreign audience is accepting him, but he does also need to think about that relationship with the business community and back home as well. And I think you wrote in your piece, this isn't kind of the first instance of that as well. I remember when he spoke about Kiwis being, what was it? Was it wet and whiny? Were those the words?
Yeah. And negative.
Yeah. I think it's an issue for him that he feels like he always has to be political point scoring. And this sort of trade delegation is the thing that's supposed to be bipartisan. Trade deals, that international travel, it gives the PM a good political boost at home because it's usually good news. But he doesn't need to secure that boost by running down the opposition. And when he does that, he actually ends up losing out on that opportunity for that political boost himself.
And to that point, Marc, as well, I mean, his office has spoken to me in the past about the concept of a low information voter, right? And that's really all they need to do here. They need to make sure that they've got good pictures of Christopher Luxon on the TV screen at 6 p.m. shaking hands with foreign dignitaries, with all of the pomp and ceremony that goes with it. So he doesn't need to be political point scoring. He just needs to get those pictures back home. And the majority of people will think he's doing a really good job for New Zealand on the world stage.
And look, the other thing about what Luxon's been saying on this trip, which was interesting to me, and a faint sort of warning bell, is that he's talked up very much that he is going to be the Prime Minister or the leader of this country who's going to be out there hustling the most and away and in those markets unashamedly, which is a good thing on certain levels. But what has been the case with other Prime Ministers is they get seduced by the international forums, by the acclaim and the grandstanding and the handshaking and the gifts and the international media and so on. Right back to Jim Bolger, he got to a point where he was kind of thought he was our chief statesman. Clark was very good at it, but it certainly was something that grew in her time that she would do more of and enjoyed more, as did Key. And Ardern we know as well on that global kind of stage. The reason I raise it as a faint warning bell is that it's very early in Luxon's time, and in most of the other instances, it's been once they've got things under control and stable and running as they ought domestically, and it's also been when sometimes they want to get away from the domestic political scene and find a bit of a safe harbour. It'd be a shame for Luxon if he gets too far away from things domestic. He's got a three-way coalition. He's got a lot ahead of him, the economy, as we know. He wants outcomes. It's not something that's a sort of a nice sanctuary, and hopefully won't get to that.
And I remember those lines during Ardern's time where she was being called the part-time PM. And also we've seen recently, like with the Thai Prime Minister, how he kind of grounded himself for, I think it was 6 months or something like that after such, public backlash to him always being overseas. It is important to strike that balance, isn't it? And I mean, we've talked about the C list and the Tagalongs and talked a little bit about the 757, but there's been other kind of domestic, I guess, news with a bit of a foreign flavour that have also dominated his trip there, hasn't it, Marc?
Yeah, on his second day in Japan, Luxon was asked about the press conference that he held last week with the Chinese premier, where questions weren't allowed to be asked. A staff journalist attempted to ask about the documentary that they've put out, that I think we talked about briefly last week in the recommendations, at least, around foreign interference in New Zealand. And she says an official, a New Zealand official, put his hand on her shoulder, told her to stop asking the questions. He said no multiple times. And later, a spokesperson for the PM's office called it a stunt. And he was asked about that incident and kind of declined to say that it was bad when New Zealand reporters want to do their job and ask questions. And the protocol that's established between those Chinese and New Zealand diplomats says that that's not supposed to happen. How Luxon positions himself in response to that sends a strong signal to everyone about, are these values, these New Zealand values that he talks about, actually important to him, or are they more window dressing for the trade and the benefits that he sees in the relationship with China.
And of course, China has, come up a lot during his visit in Japan because of those, geostrategic tensions. And while he probably would have been wanting to talk more about those, those big kind of military and defence and security pacts and things like that, he was kind of pulled back down into this domestic issue around New Zealand's press freedom. And I mean, there were these big deals and things that were signed while we were over there, but I mean, I would struggle to tell you exactly what they were off the top of my head. You know, it was those negative things that kind of dominated once again for the Prime Minister.
And I think there's a responsibility on all of us in the media to make some sense of the Korean commitment that we've made and also the new deal with Japan, and Newsroom will. It's hard for these travelling journalists and for those left behind in Wellington to get a whole lot of detail and to make a whole lot of sense of these things. It's a very fast-moving, these trips. They're 2 or 3 days. They're in a bus and a coach and off to the next thing, to some rugby or kiwi fruit promotion. So it mixes it all up, so you don't get a chance perhaps to get as good a grip on it. But I think it's incumbent on us to do so, because these plays probably will have lasting significance.
Welcome to Scrutiny Week. Too often, Select Committee hearings feel like a bit of a sprint. There's barely enough time to start digging into a topic, and the Minister or expert submitter or department head is gone, but not this week. For the first time, Parliament has run what it calls Scrutiny Week, a week where the House isn't sitting and ministers have to front up in person for prolonged questioning on their spending decisions that were laid out in last month's budget. Now, Marc, you have made a fantastic and quite fancy calendar for our team. I just want to put that out there first to keep track of the dozens and dozens of hearings that have been happening all around the parliamentary precinct this week. So I want to say thank you for that. And you've also attended a lot of these sessions yourself this week. Give us a sense of how it's going for first Scrutiny Week.
Yeah, I think there are some growing pains, I think it would be fair to say. It's the first time that they're doing this, both on the side of the Select Committee chairs and the MPs sitting on those committees, figuring out how this differs from a normal Select Committee hearing, how it differs from a question time in the House. It seems like the style and the mood is maybe landing somewhere in between, a bit more fiery than the usual Select Committee hearing, but not quite the level of grandstanding that you get during question time. But it's also worth remembering that for these ministers, a lot of them, they're first-time ministers, and for all of them, they're just still betting into their portfolios after the election. And so I wonder, as this term goes on and we have more scrutiny weeks to come, and there should be 2 a year according to the kind of new rules that have been set up for these events, whether the quality of the discussion will improve, whether ministers will be more able to answer questions on their own and less deferring to department heads, and maybe whether the opposition MPs in particular who are doing the questioning can maybe tone it back a bit and try and find the accountability, the pointed questioning without having to do the interjecting and interrupting the minister's answer and actually giving them a chance to explain the point that they're trying to make.
Because I think it's probably important to mention that it differs somewhat to usual Select Committee hearings in that the chairs have been told there should be sustained questioning where, members, especially opposition members who get priority in these hearings, get a chance to ask a question and a follow-up question and another follow-up question, before someone else takes over that line of questioning, so they can really tease out the detail. But what has been starting to happen is it becomes this backwards and forwards, quite heated debate between a minister or a department head and an opposition MP, and then because of that, things are becoming quite broad as well. They're going well beyond what's covered in the estimates or the budget. It's going into general policy, into coalition agreements, and the opposition is trying really hard to find some kind of link back to the budget, and they're not always succeeding at that. So I agree with your point, Marc. There's a lot of skill to be learnt, I think, in terms of asking the right question in the right way. And I'd like to say that yesterday I was sitting in on the hearing relating to Oranga Tamariki, and I thought that new Green MP Kahurangi Carter did a fantastic job of this. There were senior Labour MPs who have been ministers recently who couldn't quite get that questioning right. It was broad, it was layered with assumptions and implications, and so they weren't really getting the answer they wanted. And then Kahurangi Carter was bringing it back and referencing specific points in the budget documents, and she was getting more detail and a clearer answer. So there's something in that. We've heard that Oranga Tamariki had to restructure its restructure because they were worried that in getting rid of a whole lot of lawyers that it was actually going to impact on their ability to deliver frontline services. So it's not just about kind of the process or about the politics of it. There's also been Like a lot of substantive information coming out throughout this week, I think.
The only other thing I'd add is I'm less concerned about the argy-bargy between opposition MPs and ministers, or even department heads, although ideally those people maintain their sort of non-political status. The thing that's seems like the biggest waste of time is when opposition MPs get into fights with committee chairs over, I haven't had enough questions, or you've interrupted my line of questioning. The chairs seem to be doing a pretty good job, at least, of the former issue in terms of tracking how those questions are being assigned. Aisha Viral at one stage saying, surely I should get another sup here to the chair of the Health Committee, Sam Uffindell, who replied, well, the opposition has had 10 of the last 11 questions, so I am going to go over to the government side. The government questions, generally pretty boring, pretty much patsy questions, could do without those as well.
I mean, Tim, I'm interested in your thoughts as someone observing from the outside. What do you think of New Scrutiny Week? Is it adding any value, do you think?
I think these are valuable because the question time in the House is too often just performative nonsense, and too little is elucidated, too much sparring, too little fact. A question for you both is, in select committees, are the appearing ministers bound as they are in the House by their answers to not mislead the House, not mislead the committee? Is there a duty there that they have to be factual and honest and upfront?
My understanding is yes. I remember there have been instances in the past where someone has gotten something wrong and they've had to correct the record or provide the committee with a follow-up answer or documents that correct the record. So I would assume that the same rules apply for Scrutiny Week. Is that your understanding, Marc?
Yeah.
My second point is that I think it's a better forum because that sitting down eyeball to eyeball, more conversational, even though it might be in some sort of conflict between the parties, tends to get a slightly more honest, a little bit more revealing, sometimes a little more impatient response where you get some, something you didn't know and something they weren't probably scripted to say by their staff coming out. And I think that can be valuable for what we get to know about motivation behind policies and behind budget decisions. So, look, so far, and I've really enjoyed the extensive coverage on Newsroom from your team. Thank you. And I think it's going to be something that people will approach media and others more seriously and more comprehensively as they become part of the deal, yeah.
And to your point as well, Tim, I mean, often you will show up to a select committee hearing, in recent years, and there just aren't any media there. And some of that is because it is streamed online, so you can watch it from your desk or you can watch it delayed. But sometimes it's just people don't have the capacity, they don't have the interest. Whereas this week, the media benches have been full. Media have been pushed back into the cheap seats with everyone else. But that's really great to see that there's this extra scrutiny of Scrutiny Week.
A quick question. How is Sam Uffindell as a chairman? He's only known to the public as one thing, so let's hear a bit about his performance.
I think he is still a relatively new MP, and I think that shows. There are other people in National's backbenches who I would have chosen above him for chair of a select committee, of any select committee. I think he kind of holds his own in those arguments with Aisha, and clearly was ready for that sort of questioning about, hey, this isn't fair, when he could point to those numbers and say, yes, it is actually. I think for a while we've actually had, but between both governments, the Health Committee have this chair who's maybe a little bit too deferent to the Health Minister and to the government side of things. You will remember quite clearly, I think, a lot of the arguments that Chris Bishop, when he was the COVID spokesperson, had with the various Labour chairs of that committee over not getting time to question Ashley Bloomfield and Chris Hipkins over their decisions during the pandemic. There's a similar vibe here, I think. Just maybe Shane Retty is a capable man. He can probably take the questions and doesn't necessarily need that management that Sam was giving him. And
interesting to note that he has been given this role as a committee chair, saying that, Luxon doesn't think he should be banished to the backbenches with no responsibility forever. You know, a lot of the other committee chairs that have been put in place for this term are people, you know, new MPs, but part of that kind of up-and-coming class, the kind of the ones to watch. And so it's interesting that he has given Uffindell this opportunity and this responsibility, I think.
And do we get any outcome from this?
Good question, Tim.
I
I know that in Australia, they have a scrutiny committee, and I understand that the scrutiny week was loosely modelled off of that. They do report back, so we will have to check up on that and see if there are reports that come out of the committees with out of scrutiny week. It seems like a really good idea. I also think that that's a massive workload when we're looking at the number that are, you know, happening at the moment. Doesn't mean it shouldn't happen.
Yeah, they've all got a lot on.
Our listener question today is, what is the most expensive species to save from extinction? Now, Marc, a little bit of context first. You went along to the hearing where Conservation Minister Tama Potaka essentially said something along the lines of, it's too expensive to save all of our Indigenous species, so we're going to have to choose. Can you tell us a little bit more about what's going on there?
Yeah, in the vein of unforced errors that we've been talking about today, it was something he freely volunteered most of the way through an answer to a largely unrelated question, where he just said, look, our comrades in the environmental movement often say we have to save every species. I think that's very irresponsible to say if we don't know how much that's going to cost. In theory, what he was saying there is not novel. We know that it costs money and that DOC has to prioritize its efforts and that sort of thing. But generally, the position of the Conservation Minister, as Rachel Brooking pointed out, is that the aim is that species don't go extinct. It's not about finding which ones are most cost effective. My initial impression was that maybe he had just misspoken a little bit there and then stuck to his guns under some more questioning from opposition MPs. But my understanding is it's actually a concept he's communicated to environmental advocates in the past, saying we might not have the money for this, which has, I think, surprised and disappointed quite a range of different kinds of people, not just the kind of traditional maybe greenies and lefties, but there's a strong strain of conservation on the right as well, who have been perturbed by this comment.
And I remember seeing that Helen Clark tweeted something like, this is a classic example of someone who knows the cost of everything and the value of nothing, which I thought, summarised that relatively well.
Yeah, I mean, in policy, generally we do look at costs, but there are some areas where we go, the costs are worked through, but the focus is around what's most important to save. We don't necessarily say, we can't save every cancer patient because it's too costly. We don't save every cancer patient because it is too costly. But that's not the emphasis. That's not where we focus our kind of rhetoric.
Still try.
He was being fatalistic, but was he being unrealistic? In pure political terms, what's the appropriate response or message for a conservation minister to give there, Marc?
I think, to start with, he didn't need to go into that territory at all. But were he asked about it, I think the appropriate political message would be, we will always endeavour to save every species that we possibly can, and then divert into talking about some of the good efforts that DOC is doing on the kakapo or the takahe or something like that, and you kind of worm your way out of it pretty easily.
You've spent too much time around these people, Marc.
Hasn't this coalition already given away Freddie the Frog?
Yes, well, Freddie the Frog is gone burger, as our former host would say. I think Shane Jones has made that very clear. That's maybe less of a cost thing and more, it seems, a personal vendetta between Shane and the Frog. Not clear what happened there. Perhaps a historical dispute.
When we were, and I think it's okay to say this, we were meeting with Shane Jones earlier this week, and he described those comments as, what was it? A seagull around his neck, and then one of his staffers said that's an albatross, I think. Minister.
And in answer to our listener question, though, Marc, is there any value? Do they do them by the spend they put on to particular species to save? Is there something that's costing us the most to keep going?
Well, the other thing that Tama Potaka said was that he hasn't seen any costings for it, which was also why it was strange to bring that up in the first place. It makes you wonder if he's now going to ask DOC to cost each species. And
line by line.
Go line by line through the list to figure out what to cut. I think in the office, our consensus when we're looking at animals, not and birds, mammals, that sort of thing, we'll leave the lichens and maybe some of the invertebrates aside. Kakapo, probably the most expensive. They live on these islands, all the flights to go back and forth, and they were almost killed by a mushroom, wiped extinct in 2019 as well. So not all that robust or resilient. The other idea that was mooted was we have 5 species of kiwi, which sounds like you could just pay for just the one and get the benefit of all of them anyways.
And I think one person in the office, our colleague, was it Emma Hatton, suggested that perhaps if we're going to save one of the kiwi, we save laser kiwi, and then Defence Force picks up some of the tab there. I'm not sure. Let's wrap up with some recommendations, something you watched, read or listened to this week that you enjoyed. Tim, let's start with you.
Mine's a good look from The Guardian at the political weaponising of videos of Biden and Trump, to a degree, looking old and bewildered, and the way that their opponents are using these out of context often to make them look less electable. Good read.
Cool. I am going to recommend Marc's article on David Seymour's Snapchat interactions with school-age kids. It's there's some very rigorous reporting there, and it obviously involves a very senior political figure in New Zealand. So I encourage people to go and read the whole thing. Marc.
I'm recommending the New York Times' article this week about the new publisher of the Washington Post and the incoming executive editor, both having been implicated in the British phone hacking scandals. Sort of been a series of articles that have led up to this at a bunch of different outlets, and it sounds like more news has come out more in recent days as well. It's a good summary of the current situation, and you can keep reading on for what sounds like it'll be an ongoing story for quite a while.
That is it from Raw Politics this week. A huge thank you to our producer, Hugo Stewart, who is actually leaving us to travel overseas. Thank you so much for all the work you've put into the Raw Politics podcast. You have made it all that it is. And thank you, of course, also to our readers, listeners and viewers. Please send any burning questions you have to laura.walters@newsroom.co.nz. You can find us next week here on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.